Pavel Lakachuk, Head of Military Programs at the Center for Global Studies Strategy 21. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Good morning, glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Pavel, well then, 1,300,000. That's the number of Russian losses, both those eliminated and those who are no longer able to fight. The wounded, the severely wounded, and so on. 1,300,000. That's those 1,300,000 who will never return to the front. How significant is this loss for the Russians when we're talking about such a number?
Well, you can add a few 100,000 more to that. Various kinds of deserters who are now wandering around the occupied territories of Ukraine. It is a form of blatant blackmail, systematically terrorizing and intimidating the entire population of Ukraine. And they're being chased by their own colleagues from the Russian National Guard and so on. However, if we take a much closer look at the reality of what is currently taking place on the ground within the various occupied territories of Ukrainian land, it becomes clear that the so-called Russian law enforcement agencies, and I use that term very loosely, aren't really eager to do any actual work. Therefore, it is highly likely that this specific number could actually be significantly higher than what is being officially reported. You can compare it to the fact that the current Russian army consists of about 1 million people. Since 1922, the Russians have lost 1.5 active armies.
In the Freedom app, live broadcasts, special projects, reports from around the world, and up-to-date analysis. All the most important things right on your smartphone. Simple, fast, convenient, and free. Download the Freedom app from the App Store or Play Market. One click and you're already at the center of events. Knowing everything with Freedom is easy. Regarding the goals of the Russian troops, has the Russian command set itself another deadline, as you can see, for capturing? Now it's about Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region, April 25th. However, Ukrainian soldiers consider these plans unrealistic. The soldiers of the 11th Army Corps note, the enemy is trying to enter the city directly and use the buildings for cover. And this means fighting in urban conditions, which significantly slows down their advance. Flanking maneuvers have not yielded results so far, so a rapid capture of the settlement is unlikely, Ukrainian defenders claim. According to the military's assessment, even with active assaults and the use of all available resources, the timeline could stretch out for several months, possibly until autumn. How do you evaluate such deadlines? Why do they still exist in the Russian army? There remains a certain foundation for some kind of aggressive intentions. So what do Russian troops need for this if they intend to get involved by April 25th?
Well, obviously they'd have to bust their asses. All these deadlines, well, it could be due to leaks from some new Russian plans that are drawn up, not fulfilled. Then new ones are made, so it's not really worth tying yourself to them. Usually, whenever an official announcement like this is finally made public, it clearly signifies that this specific strategic direction is being seriously considered as one of the primary objectives. And indeed, at this very moment, the area of Kostiantynivka has become one of the most critical and key directions for the ongoing Russian offensive, especially after they have completely abandoned, or at the very least indefinitely postponed, their previous plans, attempts at a strategic encirclement of our group of forces in Donetsk region, in the northwest of Donetsk region. And they are trying to make use of the opportunities they have through a frontal assault. Siversk became such a signal in the shift to frontal attacks. Now, Kostiantynivka. Indeed, the situation there is very difficult. The enemy is encircling the city from 3 sides. And accordingly, working with the defense forces is becoming increasingly difficult. Moreover, now war has changed. It is a war of drones, and it is easier to hold the defense in the foreground. The enemy has been captured in front of the settlement or behind the field, behind the settlement. Urban combat remains the most... This is the most brutal and bloody of all, and the absolutely critical and primary objective right now is not to let any Russian groups infiltrate or slip into the heart of the city. If they somehow manage to establish a firm and lasting foothold there, it will inevitably take significantly more forces and resources to drive them out again. At the moment, there have been several cases where the Russians break through, even making it to the center of Kostiantynivka. But when Z-bloggers say that our flag raisers or our forces have secured a position in the city, that's not true. For now, at least, they are being driven out of Kostiantynivka. How will events unfold from here? At this moment, I am simply not ready to provide a specific estimate regarding exactly how many months the city of Kostiantynivka will be able to hold out. I cannot say that for certain either. Our primary task remains to ensure that we do not surrender any of our cities to the invading forces. The primary task of the heavily armed occupying military forces is to push forward relentlessly, regardless of the heavy price they must pay. But as for exactly how, and for how many grueling months or long years this brutal conflict will continue to unfold, the battle for Kostiantynivka, hardly anyone can say right now. It definitely won't be in April.
Pavel, it seems that lately just about everyone has been talking quite a lot about the recent expansion of these so-called kill zones, both for the Ukrainian side and for the Russian side. A kill zone, in simple terms, is drone control. That is, it's an area where infantry can hardly enter. How much can this worsen the situation in terms of the advance of either side? Are there any solutions for this right now, so to speak?
There are no solutions. Kill zone is a shortened term for a zone of guaranteed destruction. The name says guaranteed, but in reality, it's not always guaranteed. It's not precise and depends on many factors. On weather conditions, as well as the density of forces and assets, not just drone operators on both sides, but also electronic warfare systems and their types. On the current weather conditions, on the time of year, whether it's winter or early spring or autumn, now that the lush greenery is beginning to flourish, the fundamental nature of the environment undergoes a transformation once again. This shift determines exactly which technical means will be utilized, including specialized drones along with their sophisticated internal firmware. Ultimately, it all depends on which side can react with greater speed and respond in a more timely and effective manner. These transitions also depend heavily on which side manages to act with the greatest level of effectiveness. But naturally, it is extremely difficult to predict with any certainty during the spring months what the specific kill zones will look like by the time fall arrives. This is because both the primary means of destruction, that is, the drones themselves, and the use of drones as spotters for various other types of weaponry are constantly evolving. They are undergoing constant refinement and improvement on a daily basis, practically in real time. And in 6 months, it's possible that the nature of combat operations will change significantly. Right now, in recent days, it has been it would be highly beneficial and advantageous to use those specific algorithms that were well known and thoroughly tested during the cold winter period. Yes, literally, in just 1 week, the environmental conditions will change in a completely radical and unpredictable manner.
Do these changes depend on the enemy's tactics, on the enemy? The Russian army continues offensive operations near Lyman in the Donetsk region, but has changed its tactics after an unsuccessful assault. This was stated in a comment to RBC Ukraine by the spokesperson of the 3rd Army Corps, Alexander Borodin. He reported that large-scale mechanized attacks by the Russians are no longer being used. Instead, the invaders are operating in small infantry groups, sometimes using quad bikes and motorcycles for rapid maneuvers. Let's hear the quote and continue.
The offensive actions we have seen recently and those that took place in 2022, maneuverable mechanized blitzkrieg offensives by the Russians, have cost them dearly. After all, restoring equipment is quite an expensive undertaking. The Russian occupiers have chosen a tactic aimed at disrupting the ability of our personnel to rotate. This is achieved precisely through these small-scale assaults. They don't count people, so from an economic standpoint, this is advantageous for them. Alexander Borodin, spokesperson for the 3rd Army Corps, in an interview with RBC Ukraine.
As you see it, what is actually behind the change in tactics? Could it be due to weather conditions in some areas, or is it still a result of failed assaults?
Well, I wouldn't compare it to 2022. That's not really accurate because 2022 was an advance of a column in the context of a breakthrough, a strategic breakthrough of defenses in several directions. And that's called advancing by March. The Russians haven't been able to advance by March for 3 years now. The current state of the war has gradually transitioned to positional defense, to a layered defense, which simply cannot be overcome through simple or direct means. You won't succeed with columns, you won't break through. And throughout these 3 long and grueling years of intense positional warfare, the Russian forces have utilized, depending in large part on the steady improvement of their offensive strike capabilities and the overall availability of appropriate strike means, several traditional and well-established tactical maneuvers and combat techniques, ranging basically from heavy mechanized assaults, all the way to coordinated small unit infantry-led assaults. And however, to suggest that they are completely moving away from mechanized assaults would not be a completely accurate assessment of the situation. Because from time to time, by the way, also in the Lyman direction, there was a recent attempt at such a... It was a significantly large and coordinated mechanized armored assault operation, which was successfully repelled and driven back, resulting in heavy losses for the enemy. These types of rather rare attempts now alternate with constant, relentless infantry pushes that frequently utilize sophisticated infiltration tactics. The specific topic of infiltration has arisen primarily because of the inherent fluidity and evolving nature of our current defensive positions along the front line, requiring a more detailed analysis of how these maneuvers are being executed against us. If a year or 2 ago, people talked about the possibility of a major breakthrough back when our defense system was built quite densely, things are different now. Currently, our defensive positions are very sparse, primarily due to a severe and critical shortage of available military personnel. That is exactly why this specific tactic of small unit infiltration is being used, as it yields the greatest results on the battlefield. However, it is important to note that it is just as costly in terms of human resources and lives lost. Breaking through this Kiev zone of many kilometers when it was 1.5 kilometers there is one thing, but once upon a time there were still 20 positions there. In the sector of Avdiivka, he is 23 years old. Currently, the distance is only about 400 meters, while between the enemy's forward positions and our own lines, the actual distances between these positions can now range anywhere from 6 to 8 kilometers apart. This is the gray area. To successfully traverse a distance of 8 kilometers without being spotted or completely neutralized, and then to infiltrate deep into our rear positions for that same distance, one can easily imagine how utterly futile and desperate this action is under the current conditions of our active defense.
How much does this in general disrupt the Kremlin's plans? No matter how dramatic that may sound, but still, the Russian occupiers, they wanted to seize all of Ukraine, then their appetite shrank to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and now their ambitions revolve around settlements like Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. Fighting for Pokrovsk has been going on, if I'm not mistaken, for more than 19 months now, active fighting, and the Russians still have not managed to take full control of it. And they are suffering there, colossal losses. These constant failures, all the constant missed deadlines that the Kremlin's military leadership sets for its troops directly on the front line. This could somehow lead to changes in their overall offensive tactics, but we see that they simply change them. One moment they want to encircle a particular settlement, then they advance with heavy equipment, then with motorcycles, then with ATVs, then with infantry. All these different types of offensives, they are all destroyed by drones, by precision artillery, and by that very infantry. Counter-offensive actions, which Syrski spoke about, could this lead to yet another change of some sort in Russian tactics? Or is it all just the same as it has been since World War II, since the days of the Red Army? They just push forward with sheer numbers. You remember, right? That legendary story. One rifle for two soldiers, and they just advance with numbers. For the motherland, for Putin.
Well, when we look at the tactics compared to World War II, things have certainly changed quite a bit, but any tactical methods are always based on certain fundamental constants. These core constants remain largely unchanged even today, and combat operations are determined by a combination of various tactical methods, alternating them so that the enemy cannot predict your next moves. So on the one hand, there remains this persistent tendency, such a persistent trend. When it comes to the actual conduct of modern combat operations, on the other hand, roughly every 4 to 6 months, or maybe even more often now, it is becoming increasingly difficult to even specify a clear period. The fundamental nature of the weaponry being used changes significantly, and so does the entire tactical picture on the battlefield. But this is seen by colonels and majors on the battlefield, while Gerasimov, somewhere in the basement, he no longer sees this. He has completely different arrows and completely different plans, which he reports to the Kremlin dictator. Putin lives in a completely different world. And he's not concerned at all about the losses of the Russian army, human resources, or material resources. He lives in his own imagination. Why? Just about a year ago, or perhaps only a few short months ago, Vladimir Putin was speaking quite optimistically to Donald Trump, saying something like, well, let's just wait and see how things develop. He was sure that what Gerasimov was reporting to him, that if you just give me another month, I'll capture and destroy all the armed forces of Ukraine, and then we'll have a clear path to Kiev, to Dnipro, wherever you order, was true. Putin believes him. Putin repeats after him. As a direct result of these failures, the Russian army is now completely immobilized and unable to make any significant progress. None of Putin's international partners or strategic allies believe in the overall military capability and strategic effectiveness of his forces, but he himself remains firmly and stubbornly convinced of its ultimate success. And as long as this Kremlin rat is convinced of it, they will keep grabbing more and more people and throwing them onto the front in Ukraine in order to satisfy and fulfill the ambitious and demanding wishes of the dictator residing within the Kremlin walls.
Thank you, Pavel, for joining us. Let me remind our viewers Pavel Lakichuk, head of military programs at the Center for Global Studies Strategy 21, was with us on the line.